There are nights when men discover what they are made of, when leadership is not a rank but a series of impossible choices made in darkness, when survival depends on convincing your enemy that you still have bullets when your last magazine ran empty hours ago. Captain Everett Pope stood on a coral ridge in September 1944 with 235 Marines at dawn and 24 by the next sunrise, and in those hours between, he learned that rocks can sound like grenades if thrown hard enough, that fear has a taste like copper, and that some positions must be held not because they can be defended but because ordering a retreat would mean accepting that good men died for nothing. This is the story of Hill 100, where the margin between annihilation and survival was measured in handfuls of coral rock, where the Japanese came in waves all night long, and where a company of Marines fought past the point where fighting should have been possible. The island of Peleliu looked like hell had been compressed into 6 square miles and dropped into the western Pacific. The aerial reconnaissance photographs shown to the assault troops of the 1st Marine Division had been sanitized, clinical, informative in the way that lies by omission can be informative. They showed beaches, ridgelines, the Japanese airfield that was the official reason for taking the island, but they could not convey the texture of the place, the geological nightmare that awaited them. Peleliu was ancient coral thrust up from the ocean floor millennia ago, and then sharpened by rain and heat into a labyrinth of razor-edged ridges, caves that descended hundreds of feet into darkness, and ravines so steep and narrow that 2 men could barely walk abreast. The Japanese had spent months fortifying this natural fortress, turning every cave into a pillbox, every ridge into a killing ground, and they had done so with the certain knowledge that the Americans would come eventually, that the war was turning against them, and that Peleliu would be where they made the price of that turn unacceptable. Captain Everett Pope was not a career military man in the traditional sense. Before the war, he had been living a life that now seemed impossibly distant, a life where the most pressing concerns did not involve calculating how many grenades his platoon sergeants had left or whether the wounded could walk under their own power. He had joined the Marines because young men of his generation joined when their country called, and he had risen to command Company C, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines because competence and courage under fire have a way of revealing themselves quickly in combat. By September 1944, he had been in the Pacific long enough to understand that every island was its own special kind of hell, but Peleliu was different. The intelligence estimates had promised a quick operation, 3 or 4 days at most. Those estimates were now a bitter joke whispered among exhausted men who had been fighting for more than 2 weeks with no end visible. The morning of September 30th broke hot and white over the Umurbergal Ridges, the complex of coral peaks that the Marines had begun calling the Horseshoe or Bloody Nose Ridge or simply the Goddamned Ridges, depending on how recently they had lost friends there. Company C had been tasked with securing Hill 100, a designation that referred to its height in feet and that conveyed nothing about its strategic importance or the cost of reaching it. The hill was part of a larger ridge system that overlooked the Japanese defensive positions deeper in the Umurbergal, and taking it meant denying the enemy observation and potentially opening a route into their rear areas. In the mathematics of infantry tactics, it was valuable terrain. In the mathematics of human cost, it was about to become expensive beyond calculation. Pope gathered his platoon leaders in the gray pre-dawn light, and they bent over a map that was already stained with coral dust and sweat. The plan was straightforward in the way that all plans are straightforward before contact with the enemy introduces variables that no staff officer anticipated. Company C would advance along the ridge, clear any Japanese positions encountered, and establish a defensive perimeter on Hill 100. They would be supported by artillery from the division's big guns positioned near the airfield, and they would maintain radio contact with battalion headquarters. They would dig in, hold the position through the night, and be relieved or resupplied in the morning. It was a textbook operation, and every officer present knew that textbooks were written by men who survived to write them, which meant the textbooks necessarily excluded all the variations where things went catastrophically wrong. The approach to Hill 100 began well, which should have been the first warning. Company C moved along the ridge in a tactical column, weapons at the ready, every man scanning his sector, and they encountered only sporadic sniper fire that forced them to take cover but did not stop their advance. The Marines had learned to read terrain the way sailors read water, looking for signs of danger in the landscape itself, and everything about this approach felt wrong. The coral was too quiet. The draws and defile that should have concealed Japanese machine gun nests appeared empty. Either the enemy had withdrawn, which seemed unlikely given their fanatical defense of every position so far, or they were allowing Company C to advance into a trap. Pope halted the column twice to send out flanking patrols, and both times the patrols reported no contact. The only rational decision was to continue forward, because standing still on Peleliu was simply a different way of dying. Hill 100 revealed itself gradually as Company C climbed, the coral ridge widening into a relatively flat area perhaps 40 yards long and 20 yards across at its widest point. The Marines immediately began preparing defensive positions, which on Peleliu meant finding whatever cover the coral provided naturally and improving it with entrenching tools that rang uselessly against stone harder than the tools themselves. There was no soil to dig into, only razor-sharp rock that cut through uniforms and skin with equal ease. The men piled coral chunks into low walls, scraped out shallow depressions behind larger boulders, and positioned their machine guns to cover the approaches from the north and east, where the terrain sloped away into a maze of smaller ridges and ravines. The position was not ideal, but ideal was a concept that had no meaning on Peleliu. The position was defensible, which meant that a determined enemy could be slowed but probably not stopped, and it was exposed, which meant that Japanese artillery could find them if they had the coordinates and the shells to spare. By early afternoon, Company C had established a perimeter that satisfied Pope's minimal requirements for a defensive position. His Marines were spread thin, gaps between fighting holes that would have been unacceptable in a training exercise but were unavoidable given the size of the company and the dimensions of the hilltop. He positioned his best riflemen at the most likely avenues of approach, kept his platoon sergeants mobile so they could respond to breakthroughs, and established a small command post in a coral depression near the center of the perimeter. The radio operator set up his equipment and made contact with battalion, reporting that Company C had secured Hill 100 and was digging in. Battalion acknowledged, confirmed that resupply and reinforcement would come in the morning, and signed off. That brief radio exchange contained every assumption that would prove false in the hours to come. The Japanese began probing the position in late afternoon, small groups of 3 or 4 soldiers moving through the broken coral, testing the perimeter, drawing fire to identify machine gun positions and fields of fire. The Marines shot at movement and shadows, expending ammunition at a rate that Pope found concerning but not yet critical. Each probe was driven back with rifle and machine gun fire, and the Marines began to relax fractionally, believing that they had the measure of the enemy's strength in this sector. That belief lasted until the sun began to set and the nature of the attacks changed. The probes became more aggressive, groups of 10 or 12 Japanese soldiers rushing specific points in the perimeter, forcing the Marines to concentrate fire and reveal the locations of their automatic weapons. Pope recognized the pattern immediately. The enemy was gathering intelligence, learning the perimeter's weaknesses, preparing for something larger. He passed word to his platoon leaders to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, and to prepare for a long night. Darkness on Peleliu did not fall gradually but arrived like a curtain dropping, the tropical sun disappearing below the horizon and taking all ambient light with it. The moon had not yet risen, and the starlight was insufficient to see more than vague shapes and movements. Pope had placed his men on 50% alert, half awake and half resting. But within the first hour of darkness that plan became irrelevant because the Japanese attacks began in earnest and did not stop. They came from the north initially, a mass of infantry moving up the slope with no attempt at stealth, screaming and firing, trying to overwhelm the defenders through shock and momentum. The Marines met them with disciplined rifle fire and machine gun bursts, and the attack broke apart 20 yards from the perimeter, leaving bodies sprawled across the coral. The Marines cheered briefly, a release of tension and fear, and then settled back into their positions to wait for the next assault. It came from the east 30 minutes later, a different group of Japanese soldiers exploiting a gap in the perimeter where the terrain made it impossible to establish overlapping fields of fire. This time the enemy reached the Marine lines, and the fighting became immediate and brutal, rifle butts and bayonets and knives in the darkness, men grappling on sharp coral that opened wounds even as they fought. Pope grabbed a rifleman and a bar gunner and moved toward the breach, firing into the mass of struggling figures, trying to separate friend from enemy in the chaos. The Japanese were thrown back after 5 minutes of close combat, and Pope counted 3 Marines dead and 2 wounded seriously enough that they could no longer fight. He redistributed his remaining men to cover the gap, pulling Marines from quieter sectors, creating new weaknesses to address the immediate crisis. The calculus of defense was becoming impossible. Every assault reduced his effective strength, and he had no reserves to commit. The attacks continued through the night in waves that followed no pattern Pope could discern. Sometimes an hour would pass between assaults, long enough for the Marines to begin hoping that the Japanese had exhausted themselves, and then the screaming would start again and shapes would emerge from the darkness and the killing would resume. Pope moved constantly around the perimeter, encouraging his men, helping to repel breakthroughs, making decisions about which sectors to reinforce and which to leave dangerously thin. He was navigating by instinct and experience, making choices in seconds that he would have agonized over given time to think, and he knew that some of those choices were sending men to their deaths. Leadership in combat is sometimes about inspiring courage and sometimes about accepting guilt, and Pope was doing both simultaneously. By midnight, ammunition was becoming critical. The machine gunners reported that they were down to their last belts, and the riflemen were sharing magazines, combining half-empty clips to make full ones, scavenging ammunition from the dead. Pope gathered his platoon sergeants in the command post and asked for an honest count of remaining ammunition. The numbers were worse than he feared. They had perhaps 200 rifle rounds total, 1 belt for each machine gun, and a dozen grenades. They could sustain perhaps one more major assault before they were reduced to fighting with bayonets and entrenching tools. The radio operator attempted to contact battalion to request emergency resupply, but the radio was either malfunctioning or the terrain was blocking the signal. They were alone on Hill 100 with minimal ammunition and an enemy that showed no signs of relenting. It was during this conference that Pope conceived the tactic that would keep his company alive through the next 6 hours. He had noticed that the Japanese assaults always paused briefly when grenades exploded among them, not because the grenades caused significant casualties in the open but because the sound and flash created momentary confusion and fear. The Marines had been throwing grenades as a last resort when the enemy closed to within 15 yards, using them to break up formations before they reached the perimeter. Pope realized that if the effect was psychological as much as physical, then anything that sounded like a grenade might produce the same pause, the same moment of hesitation. The hilltop was covered with chunks of coral, some the size of baseballs, others larger, and the coral was dense and heavy. If thrown hard enough in the darkness, a rock hitting coral would produce a sharp crack that might be mistaken for a grenade detonating. If the Marines mixed real grenades with thrown rocks, the Japanese would not know which were which until it was too late, and they might hesitate, might seek cover, might give the Marines precious seconds to aim and fire with their dwindling ammunition. Pope explained the plan to his platoon sergeants, and they looked at him in the darkness with expressions he could not see but could imagine. The plan was absurd, desperate, and so unlikely to work that it circled back to being the only option available. They passed word to the Marines in the fighting holes to gather coral rocks and pile them within reach, to throw rocks mixed with grenades when the Japanese attacked, to aim for the sound of impacts and to shout "grenade" randomly to increase the confusion. The Marines accepted this order the way Marines accept all orders that come from competent officers under desperate circumstances, with resignation and black humor and a willingness to try anything once. They began gathering rocks in the darkness, selecting pieces of coral with the weight and shape to be thrown accurately, creating small stockpiles in their fighting holes. In any other context, the sight of infantrymen preparing to fight with rocks would have been comedic. On Hill 100 that night, it was simply another improvisation in a war that had long since stopped following any rules. The next Japanese assault came from the northwest just after midnight, and it was the largest yet, perhaps 60 or 70 soldiers moving in a coordinated rush up the slope. The Marines held their fire until the enemy was close, 25 yards out, and then Pope gave the order and chaos erupted. Rifles and machine guns fired in short disciplined bursts, and simultaneously Marines began throwing rocks and grenades down the slope. The rocks cracked against coral with sharp reports that echoed across the hilltop, and the grenades detonated with their distinctive crump and flash, and the Japanese assault wavered. Soldiers dropped to the ground seeking cover from grenades that had not been thrown. Others continued forward into machine gun fire, and the entire formation lost cohesion. The Marines kept throwing rocks, shouting "grenade" and "frag out," creating an auditory landscape of constant detonations that existed more in perception than reality. The assault broke apart short of the perimeter, and the Japanese withdrew, leaving their dead scattered across the approach. Pope felt something like hope for the first time in hours. The tactic had worked, not perfectly but well enough. They had repulsed a major assault while expending minimal ammunition, and the enemy appeared genuinely confused about the volume of grenades being thrown at them. The Marines were laughing in their fighting holes, a sound that was half hysteria and half genuine amusement at the absurdity of what they were doing. They had plenty of rocks, unlimited ammunition as long as their arms held out, and the Japanese could not tell the difference in the darkness. Pope allowed himself to believe that they might survive until dawn, that the deception would hold long enough for daylight to arrive and artillery support to become accurate. The Japanese attacked again an hour later, and again the Marines met them with rifle fire and a storm of rocks and grenades that sounded far more substantial than it was. Again the assault faltered and withdrew. The pattern repeated through the early morning hours, attacks coming every 45 minutes to an hour, each one breaking against a perimeter that should have been overrun hours ago but was somehow still holding. The Marines were beyond exhaustion now, operating on adrenaline and fear and the animal instinct to survive. They threw rocks until their shoulders ached, fired their rifles when targets presented themselves, and shouted challenges and obscenities at an enemy they could barely see. Pope moved through the perimeter constantly, checking on his men, redistributing the last ammunition, telling them that dawn was coming, that they just had to hold a little longer. The largest assault came in the hour before dawn, a final coordinated push that involved what Pope estimated as more than 100 Japanese soldiers attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The Marines fired their remaining ammunition in the first 30 seconds, the machine guns rattling empty after brief bursts, rifles cracking and then falling silent as magazines emptied. And then there were only rocks and grenades, and then only rocks, and the Japanese kept coming, reaching the perimeter in places, and the fighting became hand-to-hand for the second time that night. Pope was in the center of it, using his rifle as a club because he had no ammunition left, hitting anything that moved toward him, pulling wounded Marines back from the line, pushing unwounded Marines forward to fill gaps. A Japanese soldier came at him from the side, bayonet extended, and Pope deflected the thrust with his rifle barrel and drove the butt into the man's face, feeling bone break under the impact, and moved on to the next threat without pausing to confirm the kill. The assault lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours, and when it finally broke and the Japanese withdrew, Company C was no longer a functional fighting unit by any standard measure. Pope counted 14 Marines still standing and capable of fighting, 14 out of the 235 who had started the climb to Hill 100 the previous morning. The rest were dead or wounded too severely to continue, scattered across the hilltop in fighting holes and behind coral walls, some calling for medics who could not help them and some silent in the permanent way that Marines learned to recognize. The 14 survivors had no ammunition except what they could scavenge from the dead, no grenades, no machine gun belts, nothing but rocks and bayonets and the knowledge that if the Japanese attacked again in force they would be annihilated. Dawn arrived slowly, the eastern horizon lightening from black to gray to pale orange, and with the light came the shattering impact of Japanese artillery. The enemy had waited for visibility to adjust their fire, and now shells began falling on Hill 100 with methodical precision, walking up the slope and then bracketing the hilltop, searching for the Marine positions. High explosive rounds detonated against coral and sent fragments screaming through the air, opening new wounds on men who had survived the night's fighting. Pope huddled in his command post with his radio operator and tried desperately to establish contact with battalion, to request counter-battery fire or smoke or permission to withdraw, but the radio was either damaged or the signal was still being blocked. They were cut off, pinned down by artillery, and incapable of defending the position if the Japanese followed the bombardment with infantry. Pope made the decision that would define the rest of his life in the space of perhaps 30 seconds. The position was no longer defensible. His men had held through the night against impossible odds, had accomplished the mission of securing Hill 100, but remaining in place would simply mean dying to artillery without achieving anything further. He could not in good conscience order his surviving Marines to die for terrain that had already cost so much and that would be abandoned if Company C was wiped out anyway. He crawled from fighting hole to fighting hole, shouting orders over the crash of artillery, telling his men to prepare to withdraw, to gather the wounded who could move, to be ready to displace on his signal. The problem was that withdrawing under artillery fire across open coral ridges would result in casualties approaching 100%. They needed concealment, which meant they needed smoke, and they had no smoke grenades left. Pope sent 2 Marines crawling back along the route they had used to approach Hill 100, praying that they would find battalion's lines or encounter a forward observer or discover smoke grenades on the bodies of Marines killed in earlier fighting. He gave them 10 minutes, which was longer than he should have waited and not long enough for what he was asking them to do, and then they were back with 3 smoke grenades scavenged from the dead, 3 canisters that would provide perhaps 90 seconds of concealment if the wind was favorable. Pope gathered his 14 able-bodied Marines and the 6 wounded who could walk, 20 men total out of more than 200, and he explained the withdrawal plan with the economy of words that exhaustion and urgency enforce. They would move in one group, no dispersion, because dispersion meant individuals would become lost in the broken terrain and the smoke. They would move fast as the wounded could manage, because the smoke would dissipate quickly and Japanese observers would call in fire on their route. They would not stop to engage enemy forces if encountered, because they had no ammunition to sustain a firefight. They would not go back for anyone who fell, because stopping meant dying for everyone. Pope saw the understanding in their faces, the acceptance of orders that violated every principle of never leaving the wounded behind, and he saw that they understood the mathematics as clearly as he did. Some might survive if they moved immediately. None would survive if they stayed. Pope threw the first smoke grenade down the slope, and gray-white smoke billowed up almost immediately, obscuring the route off Hill 100. He threw the second grenade 20 yards further down, layering the smoke, and held the third to throw when the first began to dissipate. The Japanese artillery was still falling on the hilltop behind them, and Pope could hear the sound of small arms fire from somewhere to the north, other Marine units still engaged in the ridges, and then he was moving and his Marines were moving with him, half carrying the wounded, stumbling over coral that seemed designed to trip and cut and slow them, breathing smoke that burned their lungs, and descending from Hill 100 for the last time. They made contact with friendly forces 20 minutes later. A platoon from Company A that was holding a position on a lower ridge and that provided covering fire while Company C completed its withdrawal. Pope reported to the battalion commander that evening, delivering a casualty count that shocked even officers who had seen heavy losses throughout the Peleliu campaign. Company C had ceased to exist as a functional unit. It would be reconstituted later with replacements, but the company that had climbed Hill 100 was gone. Its survivors scattered to other units or evacuated with wounds that would take months to heal. The official action report filed by 1st Battalion would note that Company C had successfully secured Hill 100 and held it through the night of September 30th against repeated Japanese attacks before withdrawing under enemy artillery fire. The report would mention Captain Pope's leadership and tactical innovation but would not have space to describe what that innovation looked like in practice. The image of Marines throwing rocks at enemy soldiers because they had run out of everything else, the sound of coral cracking against coral in the darkness, the psychological warfare conducted with nothing but deception and desperation. Pope himself would write letters to the families of his dead Marines, letters that said their sons and husbands had died bravely and had accomplished their mission, and he would mean those words while also knowing that no letter could convey what their last hours had been like. In November 1945, more than a year after the battle, Captain Everett Pope would stand in the White House and receive the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman for his actions on Hill 100. The citation would describe his exceptional leadership under fire, his tactical innovation in conserving ammunition, and his refusal to abandon the position until ordered to do so. Pope would accept the medal on behalf of his Marines, particularly those who had not survived to see the war's end, and he would return home to build a life that was forever divided into before Peleliu and after Peleliu, a life marked by memories that did not fade and questions that had no answers. Why had he survived when so many had died? Had his decisions that night been correct, or had there been better options that exhaustion had prevented him from seeing? Would his Marines have judged him well, or would they have blamed him for their losses? The Battle of Peleliu would continue for another 6 weeks after Company C withdrew from Hill 100, a grinding campaign of cave clearing and ridge assault that would cost the 1st Marine Division more than 6,000 casualties before the island was declared secure. The strategic value of Peleliu, always questionable, would become negligible when the war bypassed it entirely and moved on to the Philippines and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Marines who fought there would carry it with them regardless, the memory of coral ridges and caves and heat, of friends who died for terrain that was abandoned days or weeks later, of nights when ammunition ran out and survival required throwing rocks and pretending they were grenades. The 14 Marines who walked off Hill 100 with Everett Pope that morning dispersed into the vast machinery of war and its aftermath, some returning to combat with other units, others evacuated to hospitals in the rear, a few sent home with wounds or combat fatigue that made further service impossible. They would process their experiences differently, some suppressing the memories and others sharing them with anyone who would listen, but all of them would carry the knowledge of what they had endured and what they had survived. They had learned that courage is not the absence of fear but the management of it, that leadership is sometimes about making impossible choices and living with the consequences, and that the line between victory and annihilation can be measured in handfuls of rocks thrown in darkness. The story of Hill 100 would be told and retold in Marine Corps training courses as an example of tactical flexibility and leadership under extreme conditions. Officers would study Pope's decisions, analyzing his use of terrain and his improvisation with available resources, and they would debate whether his withdrawal was premature or overdue, whether he could have held longer or should have withdrawn sooner. These debates would miss the essential truth of combat, which is that decisions made in seconds with incomplete information and under mortal threat cannot be fairly judged by people sitting in safety with access to all the facts. Pope did what he believed was right in each moment, guided by his training and his instinct and his commitment to his Marines, and the result was that 20 men walked off a hill that should have been their grave. The physical scars of Peleliu would heal eventually, the cuts from coral and the wounds from shrapnel closing and leaving white lines on skin that would fade with years. The psychological scars would prove more durable, manifesting as nightmares and hypervigilance and a persistent sense that any moment of peace was temporary and that violence was always just beyond the edge of perception. Pope would learn to live with this, as would his Marines, integrating their memories into their identities in whatever way allowed them to function. Some would talk about Peleliu constantly, needing to share the burden of memory, while others would refuse to speak of it at all, protecting their families from knowledge that could not help them and could only disturb. Both approaches were valid, both were forms of survival, and neither erased what had happened. The hilltop itself would return to silence after the battle, the coral absorbing the blood and the brass and the fragments of grenades, the natural processes of erosion beginning to erase the fighting holes and the coral walls that Marines had built. Within years, the jungle would reclaim parts of Peleliu, though the ridges would remain barren and sharp, too harsh for significant vegetation. The island would become a minor footnote in World War II histories, overshadowed by larger battles with more dramatic outcomes, and only historians and veterans would remember that this small piece of coral had cost thousands of lives and had tested the limits of human endurance. The question of whether Hill 100 needed to be taken, whether the casualties were justified by the tactical gains, would remain unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Wars are fought through accumulation of small actions that seem necessary in the moment and that contribute to larger outcomes in ways that are not always clear. Company C's defense of Hill 100 denied the Japanese observation over Marine positions, disrupted their defensive plans, and forced them to commit resources to retaking terrain they had considered secure. Whether these contributions justified the loss of more than 200 Marines is a question of mathematics and morality that has no objective answer. The Marines who fought there believed they were accomplishing their mission and protecting their fellow Marines in adjacent units, and that belief gave their sacrifice meaning regardless of what historians would later conclude. Everett Pope would live into old age, building a successful career and raising a family and participating in Marine Corps reunions where old men would gather to remember when they were young and at war. He would wear his Medal of Honor on appropriate occasions and would answer questions from students and journalists about leadership and courage, and he would always deflect credit to his Marines, insisting that he had simply done what the situation required and that the real heroes were the men who had not come home. This was both true and incomplete, a simplification that protected him from discussing the complexity of his feelings about Peleliu and about command and about the cost of decisions that had kept some men alive by accepting that others would die. The lesson of Hill 100, if there is a lesson, is not about tactics or strategy but about the nature of human resilience and the bonds that form between people facing death together. The Marines who held that position through the night of September 30th did not do so because of ideology or because they understood the strategic importance of their mission. They held because the men next to them were holding, because their captain was with them making decisions and sharing the danger, because surrendering was inconceivable, and because dying without fighting back was worse than dying while fighting. They threw rocks because they had no grenades, and they kept throwing rocks because giving up meant betraying the Marines who had already died holding the same ground. This circular logic is how wars are fought and why some positions are held past all rational calculation of cost and benefit. The night sky over Peleliu on September 30th, 1944, would have shown stars indifferent to the violence occurring below, the same stars that had witnessed every human conflict throughout history and would witness many more to come. The Marines looking up between attacks would have seen those stars and perhaps found some comfort in their permanence, in the knowledge that the universe continued regardless of whether any individual survived to see the dawn. Philosophy comes easily in the moments between combat, when adrenaline recedes and exhaustion allows the mind to wander, and it leaves just as easily when the screaming starts again and the focus narrows to the immediate problem of staying alive. The sound of coral rocks hitting coral, the sharp crack that could be mistaken for a grenade detonating, would echo in the memories of the Marines who threw them for the rest of their lives. It was such a simple sound, created by such a simple action, and yet it had been the difference between being overrun and surviving until dawn. The human capacity for innovation under pressure, the ability to see possibilities that training had never covered and that manuals had never mentioned, was what had saved them. Pope's insight that psychology mattered as much as ballistics, that the enemy's perception of danger could be manipulated even when the actual danger had been exhausted, was a reminder that warfare is as much about the mind as about material. The wounded Marines left on Hill 100, those too severely injured to walk during the withdrawal, would haunt Pope for the rest of his life. He had made the decision to leave them, knowing that Japanese treatment of wounded prisoners was rarely merciful, knowing that they would likely be killed or left to die of their injuries, and he had made that decision because the alternative was remaining in place and dying with them. The wounded had understood, had urged their comrades to leave, had accepted their fate with the stoicism that Marines cultivate because showing fear is worse than feeling it. Pope would wonder for decades whether he could have saved any of them, whether a different decision at any point that night would have changed the outcome, and he would never find an answer that satisfied him. The families of the Marines who died on Hill 100 would receive telegrams informing them of their loss, formal notifications that revealed nothing about how death had come or whether it had been quick or prolonged, painless or agonizing. They would receive letters from Pope and from other survivors, letters that attempted to honor the dead while shielding the living from details that could not help them. They would wonder for years about those missing details, imagining scenarios that were sometimes worse and sometimes better than what had actually occurred, and they would never know with certainty what their loved ones had experienced in their final moments. This uncertainty is one of war's particular cruelties, the way it takes people and returns only fragments of information, leaving families to construct narratives from inadequate evidence. The Medal of Honor that Pope received would become both an honor and a burden, a recognition of exceptional service that also marked him as different from those who had not received such recognition, as if his actions had been more valuable than those of the Marines who had died doing what he had ordered them to do. He would understand the symbolic importance of the medal, the way it represented all the uncelebrated acts of courage that occurred in every battle, and he would accept it in that spirit. But he would also understand that medals are given by the living to the living, and that the dead receive only memory, which is both everything and nothing depending on who does the remembering. The coral ridge called Hill 100 would continue to exist long after everyone who fought there had died, a geological feature indifferent to the human drama that had occurred on its slopes. Rain would wash away the last traces of blood, wind would scatter the fragments of equipment left behind, and time would render the location historically significant, but physically unremarkable. Future visitors to Peleliu would walk past the site without knowing what had happened there, or they would stop and read a marker that summarized the action in a few sentences, and in either case they would not fully comprehend what those hours had cost or what they had revealed about human nature under extremity. Stories like this one exist at the intersection of history and memory, of documented fact and individual experience, and they resist simple interpretation. We can catalog the events, count the casualties, award the medals, and write the official reports, but we cannot fully capture what it felt like to be there, to make decisions with incomplete information and insufficient resources, to watch friends die and to continue functioning because the mission required it. The best we can do is listen to the veterans who were willing to share their stories, read the reports written by commanders who tried to make sense of chaos, and imagine ourselves in their place, knowing that imagination is always inadequate when confronting real suffering. The 14 Marines who walked off Hill 100 with Everett Pope were not uniquely brave or uniquely skilled. They were ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances, and they responded with the courage and creativity and endurance that ordinary people discover within themselves when survival requires it. This is simultaneously inspiring and sobering. Inspiring because it suggests that most people have hidden reserves they can draw upon when necessary. Sobering because it means that most people are capable of experiencing the trauma that comes from using those reserves. The capacity for heroism and the vulnerability to psychological damage are not opposites but rather two sides of the same human reality. The Marine Corps would preserve the story of Hill 100 in its institutional memory, teaching it to new generations of officers, and using it to illustrate principles of leadership and small unit tactics. This preservation serves multiple purposes, honoring those who fought while also providing practical lessons for those who might face similar situations. But there is always a risk in reducing complex human experiences to teaching points, in extracting lessons while discarding the messy emotional reality that surrounded those lessons. The challenge is to honor both the practical and the personal, to learn from tactics while remembering the cost. As the decades passed and World War II receded from living memory into history, the story of Hill 100 would become less immediate but not less important. New generations would encounter it in books and documentaries and museum exhibits, learning about the Pacific War through accounts like this one, and they would struggle to connect the statistics and the maps to the reality of young men fighting through the night on a coral ridge half a world away. This struggle is necessary and valuable, the effort to understand what previous generations endured and why their experiences should matter to people who did not live through them. History is not just about preserving information but about maintaining connection across time, about ensuring that sacrifice is not forgotten and that lessons learned at such cost are not lost. The survivors of Company C would carry their memories forward into peacetime, and those memories would influence how they lived their lives, how they raised their children, how they understood concepts like duty and loyalty and sacrifice. Some would become advocates for veterans, working to ensure that those who served received the support they needed. Others would retreat from public life, finding peace in privacy and in the company of people who had not been to war. Both responses were valid. Both were forms of coping with experiences that defied explanation. What happened on Hill 100 matters not because it changed the outcome of the war in any measurable way, but because it reveals something essential about what human beings are capable of when circumstances demand it. The Marines who held that position did not perform superhuman feats, but rather discovered that the boundary between possible and impossible is more flexible than anyone believes until tested. They fought when they had ammunition, and they kept fighting when the ammunition was gone. They used weapons when they had them, and they used rocks when the weapons were empty. They stayed because leaving meant betraying their dead and their mission and themselves, and when staying became truly impossible they withdrew in good order under fire because discipline survives even after everything else has failed. Everett Pope lived the rest of his life knowing that his decisions on September 30th, 1944, had determined who lived and who died among the Marines under his command. This knowledge did not make him proud or ashamed, but simply aware of the weight of leadership and the permanent consequences of choices made under pressure. He would speak to groups about his experiences when asked, always emphasizing that the real story was about the Marines who followed orders and trusted their leaders and performed acts of courage that no medal could adequately recognize. He would describe the rock-throwing tactic with a mixture of disbelief and appreciation for its effectiveness, acknowledging that desperation had produced innovation that no training manual could have taught. The Japanese soldiers who attacked Hill 100 that night remain largely anonymous in historical records, identified only by unit designations and casualty estimates. They too were following orders, fighting for their country, and dying far from home on an island that most had never heard of before being stationed there. Their courage in repeatedly assaulting a defended position despite heavy losses deserves recognition even as we acknowledge that they fought for a cause that history has judged harshly. War creates enemies out of people who might otherwise have found common ground, and it destroys without discrimination those who participate in it. The Japanese dead on the slopes of Hill 100 had families who mourned them, had futures that were erased, had experienced fear and pain in their final moments just as the Marines did. This shared humanity does not excuse the atrocities committed by Imperial Japanese forces during the war, but it does complicate the narrative and remind us that individual soldiers are rarely responsible for the strategic decisions that place them in combat. The broader context of the Pacific War, the island-hopping campaign that was slowly moving toward Japan itself, gave meaning to battles like Peleliu even when that meaning was hard to discern from a coral ridge under fire. Every island taken denied the Japanese a defensive position and brought American forces closer to being able to strike the Japanese home islands directly. The cost was measured in lives, thousands of them, and the calculation of whether those costs were justified remains contested among historians. Pope and his Marines did not have the luxury of considering grand strategy on September 30th. Their world had contracted to a hilltop 40 yards long, to the next Japanese assault, to surviving until dawn. Strategy was someone else's problem. Survival was theirs. The physical evidence of what happened on Hill 100 has long since disappeared. Metal corroded and scattered, coral eroded and overgrown where vegetation could take root. Archaeological surveys of Peleliu have documented some battle sites, recovering artifacts and mapping positions, but Hill 100 has left little behind. The evidence that matters exists instead in written records, in after-action reports and personal letters and citation narratives, and in the memories of those who survived. These forms of evidence are more fragile than physical artifacts, subject to interpretation and misremembering and loss, but they are also more immediate, more human, more capable of conveying what it felt like to be there when the outcome was uncertain and death was a constant presence. If we want to honor the men who fought on Hill 100, we must do more than remember that they fought. We must try to understand why they fought, what sustained them through a night when survival seemed impossible, what it cost them to endure, and what they lost even in surviving. We must recognize that courage is not simple or straightforward but complex and often accompanied by fear and doubt and regret. We must acknowledge that the decision to hold or withdraw, to fight or surrender, to save some by leaving others, involves moral weight that stays with the decision-maker forever. And we must commit to learning from their experience while hoping that such extreme tests of human endurance become increasingly rare in a world that finds better ways to resolve conflicts. The final image that should stay with us is not of Marines triumphant or defeated but of Marines simply enduring, throwing rocks in the darkness because they had nothing else left, trusting their captain because trust was all they had remaining, fighting for each other because abstract concepts like duty and honor had been reduced to the concrete reality of not failing the man next to you. This is what combat looks like when stripped of romance and propaganda, when reduced to its essential elements. It is brutal and exhausting and terrifying, and it requires people to do things they never imagined themselves capable of doing, and it leaves marks that never fully fade. Captain Everett Pope, the 14 Marines who walked off Hill 100 with him, and the more than 200 who did not survive or who were too wounded to continue, deserve to be remembered not as statistics or as examples of tactical doctrine, but as individuals who faced an impossible situation and responded with everything they had. Their story is specific to a night in September 1944 on an island in the Pacific, but it is also universal, a reminder of what war demands from those who fight it and what it takes from them regardless of whether they survive. It is a story about leadership under the worst possible conditions, about innovation born from desperation, about the bonds that form between people facing death together, and about the cost of victory even when victory is measured only as surviving until dawn. The question this story poses to us, the question that every war story ultimately poses, is what we owe to those who fought. We owe them memory, certainly the preservation of their stories and the acknowledgement of their sacrifice. We owe them honesty, refusing to sanitize or romanticize what they experienced in ways that would insult their intelligence and diminish their ordeal. We owe them learning, extracting from their experience whatever lessons might help us avoid similar situations or handle them better if avoidance proves impossible. And we owe them the commitment to building a world where such extreme tests of human endurance become less common, where disputes are settled through means that do not require young men to throw rocks at enemies in the darkness because they have run out of everything else. If you've listened to this story and felt something, whether admiration or sorrow or anger or simple awareness that this happened and that it mattered, then you've begun to fulfill that obligation of memory. The men of Company C cannot tell their own story anymore, most having passed away in the decades since World War II ended, but their story persists in records and in retellings and in the impact they had on everyone they touched. By listening, by learning, by remembering, You ensure that their sacrifice was not meaningless and that the lessons of Hill 100 survive even after the last person who was there has gone. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath during the night assaults or feeling relief when dawn finally came, take a moment to honor that response by engaging with it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that treat history as human drama rather than abstract data. Hit the like button if you believe these stories deserve to be told and retold. And leave a comment sharing what moment stayed with you most powerfully. What image or decision or piece of this narrative made it feel real and immediate despite the decades that separate us from that night on Hill 100? Was it the rocks sounding like grenades in the darkness? Was it Pope's decision to withdraw even though it meant leaving wounded behind? Was it the simple fact that 14 men out of 235 walked off that hill alive? Share your thoughts because these stories matter most when they create conversation, when they move from being historical events to being shared experiences that help us understand what previous generations endured and what we might be called upon to endure ourselves. The men who fought on Hill 100 did not ask for recognition. They asked only to survive, to do their jobs, to not let down the Marines around them. Most did not survive, and those who did carried the memory of that night forward into peacetime lives that were forever marked by what they had experienced. We cannot give them back what they lost, cannot undo the trauma or bring back the dead or erase the guilt that survivors feel. But we can remember them, and in remembering we can honor them, and in honoring them we can commit ourselves to learning from their example while working to build a world where such extreme examples become less necessary. That is what we owe them, and it is a debt we can only repay through memory and through action informed by that memory.